are very few things in life that are guaranteed. In fact, I believe it was Benjamin Franklin who said that the only things that were guaranteed in life were death and taxes. But there are other things that are guaranteed in life. At least, there are now. Because one of the things that's now become guaranteed in life is that if you're a JJK enjoyer, you have to watch Gege week by week slowly unravel his own universe by exposing said universe to an unrelenting slew of slaughter. Because even though sometimes we all wish we could stop time so a new chapter of JJK wouldn't come out, time stops for no man. And thus, against our wills, once again, we've been subjected to a new chapter of JJK. Chapter 254. And it's a doozy, a real testament to just the level of ire that Gege looks at his fan base with. And while this chapter admittedly went in the way that pretty much everybody with a working brain believed that this chapter would go, obviously Lobotomy Kaizen does not fall within that category, there was a twist at the end of this chapter that even the most studied JJK philosopher wouldn't have guessed would happen. See, chapter 254, while it gave us the entirety of the Sukuna versus Kusakabe fight, in the way that we assumed the Sukuna versus Kusakabe fight would pan out, and it gave us the reveal of an absolute curveball of a new combatant who's entering the anti-Sukuna coalition. It also gave us the clearest yet indication of where Gege is going with this story. And it, while not great, is exactly what I guessed it would be. See, because while this chapter might have been predictable in some moments, the tonal shift brought about by this chapter makes it entirely too clear where this story is heading. And I'll tell you right now, that shift is not for the betterment of our or Yuji's mental healths. But if we understand the clear tonal shift happening in chapter 254, we can make our best possible guess for what the ending of the story will look like. So while what might have happened in this chapter might not have been all that important, it has signaled some very important changes coming down the line. But enough with being obscure for the sake of mystery, let's get right on into it. Because today, we're talking chapter 254 of JJK reviewed. Before we get to reviewing anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you like the idea of me reviewing your favorite anime and manga, then you're gonna love my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything happening in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Or if you want to look like you listen to anime reviews, go ahead and meander on over into my merch store, otakusanonymous.net, where you can pick up some of the greatest anime t-shirts, sweatshirts, and sticker packs known to man. So buckle up if you don't know what happened in chapter 254. Things are not great right now. So the chapter opens, obviously, where chapter 253 left off. Kusakabe versus Sukuna. And it appears as though Kusakabe has decided to not go with his favorite move, running away from the fight, and is instead squaring up with Sukuna. But then again, what else would we expect from the strongest grade 1 sorcerer out? I mean, if Gojo, Nanami, and Meimei all say that he's the strongest grade 1, he should stand at least a pretty fair to good chance against a heavily injured Sukuna. And Kusakabe appears to think the same. As the chapter opens with Kusakabe opening his simple domain. Now, this is curious for both Sukuna and the reader, because so far as we understand, simple domains are really only ever used within domain expansions to nullify the guaranteed hit factor cast upon somebody when they're in somebody else's domain expansion. But simple domains are used in the new Shadow style, which is the technique that both Kusakabe and Miwa are trained in. And because it's been a while since we saw Miwa fight on account of useless, Gege takes a second to explain to us through the medium of a Kusakabe monologue that while sure, simple domains can be used to nullify the guaranteed hit factor of a domain expansion, that they don't nullify the curse technique itself. That is to say that even if Kusakabe was able to use his simple domain inside of Malevolent Shrine, well, the slashes launched at him wouldn't have a guaranteed hit factor, they would still cut through his simple domain. He would still have to dodge said slashes. And thus the opening of the simple domain confuses Sukuna, because Sukuna knows that Kusakabe knows that Sukuna can send flying slashes, but Sukuna doesn't know Kusakabe's moveset, and how it's almost entirely reliant on the opening of a simple domain. Thus, Sukuna sends some incredibly nonchalant slashes at Kusakabe, which he almost immediately brushes off with his katana. Kusakabe then goes on to explain that even though his domain is simple, within the confines of this domain, his cursed energy is amplified and Sukuna's is weakened, which makes sense because it is still, in essence, a domain expansion, just one without a cursed technique applied to it. Kusakabe is able to brush off Sukuna's strikes, actually kind of impresses Sukuna. And Kusakabe goes on to further impress Sukuna when he reveals that he's able to add an automatic system to this this process. That is to say that essentially Kusakabe is able to automate his own body to attack anything that enters his simple domain. And since Sukuna's slashes enter his domain, he's able to use intuition and the reading of Sukuna's cursed energy to deflect those slashes. However, he's also reading Sukuna's movements, which is slightly problematic because when Sukuna realizes that Kusakabe's got pretty good reflexes, he then sends another barrage of slashes at Kusakabe, who is barely able to dodge the slashes in time because Sukuna fired off the slashes without moving his body, which is insane and also something we've never seen. As we all know, cursed energy and cursed techniques operate a lot like Nen and Nen techniques in Hunter x Hunter. Risk and overcomplication makes your technique stronger. So usually most techniques require movement to even be slightly useful in combat, because a technique that requires no motion and can be activated automatically has no real risk. And yet these slashes were so powerful that Kusakabe had to dodge them, otherwise he would have died, which could kind of play into the thing that Urame said in chapter 253, that Sukuna hasn't even really gotten started yet. Now mind you, he's manually pumping his heart. We then get another flashback to Nanami, Meimei, and Gojo, who for some reason get asked about Kusakabe a whole lot. And once again, all three of them are praising Kusakabe, backing up the sentiment that they talked about earlier, where Kusakabe is the strongest amongst all grade 1 sorcerers. And in these interviews, Nanami says that Kusakabe is a swordsman with a variety of techniques. Meimei said that Kusakabe is a versatile man who can apply his skills to any situation, and Gojo says that Kusakabe's true strength comes from his simple domain trump card, going on to establish the fact that Kusakabe's true strength comes from the fact that he can create a simple domain without a binding vow, and that the effective range of his simple domain is probably the largest on Earth. Miwa then chips in and says in order to activate her simple domain, both of her feet have to be planted on the ground, but she can't even do that anymore because she can't use a sword anymore. Well, I guess she could still open a simple domain, but it's not going to do anything because she's not allowed to use a sword anymore. We then flash back to Kusakabe versus Sukuna, where Kusakabe is sensing that Sukuna is priming up for his world-cutting slash, because Kusakabe has time after time been able to deflect Sukuna's regular dismantles, but Sukuna believes that Kusakabe won't be able to deflect the world-cutting slash. However, Kusakabe picks up on Sukuna doing this by reading his cursed energy and expands his simple domain to include Sukuna within the confines of said simple domain. And even Sukuna is surprised by his ability to do this. Meimei then explains to us in the flashback that's now happening simultaneously with the fight that usually when somebody uses sword drawing, they lure their opponents into them so that they can slash them. But because of Kusakabe's incredible strength and the expansion of his simple domain to domain expansion level range, he simply expands the range of his simple domain to include his enemies. And since Kusakabe has the ability to attack whoever within his domain automatically, that allows him to essentially treat his simple domain like a domain expansion, in that the automated system that Kusakabe instilled within himself immediately attacks whoever he expands his simple domain to with a flurry of slashes, and this happens to Sukuna. As he slashes Sukuna dozens of times, it's eerily reminiscent of what happens to somebody when they enter into Malevolent Shrine without a simple domain. Nanami goes on to explain that he doesn't know of anybody who would be able to block all those slashes, and apparently Sukuna is one of the people who can't block all those slashes. But the slashes, or I guess I should say Kusakabe's katana, doesn't last for long, as it breaks. So I guess, in an essence, kind of Sukuna blocked them, but Kusakabe is apparently fine with this, because the second that his katana breaks, he removes his trench coat and begins to throw some mitts, which kind of plays into what we heard about Kusakabe from Meimei, saying that he's a versatile man with a myriad of different abilities. And I gotta say, it's kind of weird seeing Kusakabe without his trench coat. I think this is literally the first time we've ever seen it. And for a couple of panels, he kind of just looked like Higuruma. But the strikes that Kusakabe are throwing are so powerful that not only does Sukuna feel the need to block them, but also at one point after Kusakabe lands a kick against Sukuna, Sukuna is sent flying. And Kusakabe, who's apparently all about that smoke, chases down Sukuna. But while he's chasing down Sukuna, he does have the thought, why am I doing this? And it's at that point that Kusakabe realizes that he's doing all of this because he feels indebted to Principal Yaga. You know, the guy who made Panda, the principal of JJK High who was killed for backing up Yuji immediately after Shibuya and Gojo was sealed. He was killed by the principal of Kyoto High, the rocker, you remember. Now, as to why Kusakabe is indebted to Yaga, we're not entirely sure. Kusakabe is a relatively new character to the story, at least in terms of importance. I mean, obviously, he's been around since at least Shibuya, but he wasn't all that important back then. Presumably it's because Yaga gave Kusakabe a place to exist at JJK High, but who knows? But Kusakabe goes on to explain that even though Yaga is dead and gone, and therefore he shouldn't feel necessarily indebted to him, Kusakabe doesn't want to enter the afterlife and see Principal Yaga upset with him because he didn't give it his all. It's at this point that we cut back for the final time to the flashback of Gojo, Nanami, and Meimei, who are saying that the reason that they're recommending Kusakabe as the strongest grade 1 sorcerer is because he's super kind. And then, I shit you not, the next panel is Kusakabe doing the Honored One pose. Now sure, you can make the argument that this is just him dodging Sukuna's slashes by doing the Neo Matrix pose, but this pose happening within the confines of JJK after Gojo literally just said that Kusakabe is the strongest grade 1 sorcerer is either the most embedded JoJo's reference of all time or is a direct callback to the Honored One pose. And it's at this point, while hitting the Honored One pose, that Kusakabe essentially tells himself to lock in, saying that all of the kids fought with their lives on the line, so he should do the same. And thus Kusakabe once again pulls out his broken katana, but this time he activates a curse technique called Hazy Moon, which takes the shape as the rest of Kusakabe's katana. Kind of like in Naruto, how people are able to make blades out of chakra. And it's at this point that Kusakabe thrusts his katana directly at the wound that Maki left in Sukuna's chest, his heart. And it's at that moment that Kusakabe thrusts his sword through Sukuna's chest, wrenches it upwards, and Sukuna is split asunder. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen. Kusakabe, the strongest grade 1. I'm kidding. Sukuna catches the blade with 2 fingers, which actually might be less fingers than Kenjaku cut Miwa's blade with. And I can only assume that this is a callback to that moment, proving once and for all just how useless New Shadow style is. Sukuna then tells Kusakabe that you aimed for the part of my chest where I was injured. It was painfully obvious. And this is where the tonal shift in JJK becomes entirely too clear. Because in the literal next panel, we just see Kusakabe with the X-Man X cut into his chest. He's laid out on the ground, bleeding, presumably dead. And I tell you right now, when I was reading this chapter for the first time, I audibly laughed. And here's the thing, I think we were supposed to, because nobody here genuinely believed that Kusakabe stood a chance against Sukuna. Even Kusakabe didn't believe he stood a chance against Sukuna. Narratively, it would have been asinine to have Kusakabe defeat Sukuna. So not only from a power perspective was this fight doomed from the start, but also from a narrative and storytelling standpoint, this fight was doomed from the start. The real only possible chance that Kusakabe ever stood at defeating Sukuna or even surviving the fight against Sukuna was Yuji interfering. If right before Kusakabe was about to permanently join the X-Men, that Yuji flew in and stopped Sukuna's slashes. However, that wasn't gonna happen. Why do I know that wasn't gonna happen? Because that didn't happen with Maki, and Maki is undoubtedly more important to the story and more beloved by Gege Akutami than Kusakabe. So the fact that Yuji didn't fly in to stop the Black Flash that possibly killed Maki meant that he wasn't going to fly in to save Kusakabe. And while one could argue that from the moment that Maki was defeated in literally one chapter, that the tonal shift of JJK was indicating that everybody not named Sukuna was going to die, this chapter has cemented that fact. Not only just because we are now almost done with the entirety of the Kusakabe coalition, but because the tone has switched from "we have a chance" to "it's now funny to watch the Kusakabe coalition get cut down." Now, if Kusakabe had managed to hold the line against Sukuna for a couple of chapters and managed to get some actual good hits against Sukuna, I would say, okay, he's holding up long enough so other people can recover and rejoin the fight. But the fact that Kusakabe's entire fight ran side by side with 2 dead people and 1 coward talking about how powerful he was as a sorcerer in order to instill a false line of hope, but actually to set up a comedic punchline, and then Kusakabe was written to land a couple of hits against Sukuna to make everyone believe, wow, he might actually deserve to be in this fight, only for that to be massively juxtaposed with the fact that he gets off-screened, means that Gege is quite literally trying to write the deaths of these characters comedically. Trust me when I say he was not trying to instill hope in Kusakabe. He was setting up a punchline, and the punchline was death. And the idea of that is massively cemented with how this chapter ends. As soon as Kusakabe hits the floor, Ui pops in behind him to try and teleport him, presumably to Shoko. But before he's able to do that, Sukuna appears behind him. See, because Sukuna was actually waiting for him. Sukuna knew that the second that he cut Kusakabe down, he would come to teleport him back to Shoko. And thus Sukuna was essentially using Kusakabe as bait to steal the little teleporter. And thus Sukuna rather menacingly says, "You're starting to get annoying," and I'd like to interject that he's always been annoying. But within the confines of fighting against the entire Kusakabe coalition and cutting every single one of them down just to have them teleported back to somebody, possibly using a reverse curse technique to keep them all alive, I can understand why Sukuna would believe that he's annoying. And thus Sukuna, sick of not getting the full kill on his downed opponents, decides it's time to finally kill a child. And thus Sukuna launches a dismantle at Ui, which is actually how you say his name, and I hate it. Ui. Ui. I sound like a Scottish person with a lisp. But just before we were about to be freed from the idea that this minor child is somehow sleeping with his much older sister, Ui is saved by Miguel.
Nick, who's Miguel?
Well, for those of you who haven't seen Chapter 0, what are you doing? Go watch Chapter 0. Miguel is the African sorcerer who goes toe-to-toe with the likes of Gojo. But don't worry, if you didn't know who Miguel was, you and Sukuna are in the same camp, because Sukuna says he doesn't recognize him, to which Miguel responds by saying, "If you don't know who I am, you must be living under a rock." But really, not knowing who Miguel isn't crazy, because technically, while the editor's note to this chapter is the man who fought on par with Gojo enters the fray, as the Japanese kanji of the editor's note added a suffix to Miguel's name that usually is only used to denote when somebody fights on par with the other person being listed in this sentence, Miguel did anything but fight on par with Gojo. Now, we can't show you the entirety of the fight between Miguel and Gojo, but we can show you clips. For those of you who remember the Chapter 0 movie, there's about a whole 3-minute segment where Gojo is just beating the piss out of Miguel. So bad that recently, when we posted a video on this very page of the most disrespectful moments in JJK, the #1 spot was Gojo's beatdown on Miguel. And yeah, sure. Does Miguel survive this interaction? Absolutely. And yeah, sure, does this interaction kind of make Miguel and Gojo friends? As after the conclusion of Chapter 0, Gojo decides to send Yuta to Africa to train with Miguel. Yeah, that is what happens. But does this mean that Miguel fought on par with Gojo? Nope, because Miguel came into that fight with a whip that was braided by his ancestors for decades that was meant to be an anti-curse technique whip. You know, the kind of thing you would want to use against somebody with infinity. Kind of like the inverted spear of heaven, but a whip. And you know what happened to that whip? Gojo destroyed it just with straight up fists, which means that whip is gone, which means the Miguel currently standing toe-to-toe with Sukuna doesn't have that whip. And he definitely doesn't have another one of those whips on account of the fact that it took decades to make. And the events of Chapter 0 were like a year and a half ago max. So why was Miguel said to fight on par with Gojo? Because we're doing comedy at this point. The editors in Gege know that Miguel did not fight on par with Gojo. Miguel didn't land a hit on Gojo. The most effective thing he did was throw an air conditioning unit at him. And Gojo didn't open a domain, he didn't use hollow purple, he didn't even use red. He just lifted one eye and beat the hell out of the man. But saying that Miguel fought on par with Gojo was similar to getting flashbacks of Gojo, Nanami, and Mei saying that Kusakabe is the strongest out of all of the grade 1 sorcerers because he's so nice. The current purpose of this story is to have every person who's ever been even remotely good try to fight Sukuna. And for time after time after time have these individuals set up as possibly strong enough to take out Sukuna and then die. And this will go until there is no more culling game players. Because as it currently stands, all of the important culling game players are out of the game. Maki got a full-powered Black Flash to the chest from Sukuna. She is either not alive or not crushing it. Kusakabe did not make it to Shoko. He is currently bleeding out on the concrete. Yuta got damn near cut in half by Sukuna, carried away by Rika, and then teleported to Shoko by Yu. I hate that goddamn name. Chozo, while alive, already established to the crowd that he's not much of a help against Tengen, and Yuji's trying to learn how to breathe reverse curse technique into all of his blood vessels. So objectively, who else needs to die to initiate the merger? Assuming that Kusakabe, Maki, and Yuta are dead, that just really leaves Yuji and Chozo. There's a couple of other useless members of the Kusakabe coalition that might be a part of the Culling Games. I can't remember off the top of my head if Miwa ever decided to join the Culling Games, even though she was a part of the Kusakabe coalition and is nearby Shinjuku right now. But if you enter into one of the Culling Game bubbles, you become one of the players. So it's safe to assume that everybody who's battled against Sukuna or is now close to Sukuna is a Culling Game member, and that would make sense for the Kusakabe coalition to have as many members of the Culling Games as possible to make sure that initiating the merger was infinitely more difficult. But while I'm sitting here and saying all of this, I'm thinking about how incredibly difficult it would be to actually initiate the merger. And while people like Kusakabe believe that sorcerers wouldn't be affected by the merger, the fact that it was set up that Megami, and therefore by extension Sukuna, can now initiate the merger has really led people to believe that there will be one of two possible conclusions to JJK. The first of which is that people believe that somehow one of these irrelevants will weaken Sukuna to the point that Megami will be able to take over his body. Now, of course, this was the strategy when Yuta was still breathing, and Yuji, who has the ability to resonate with souls through punches, was able to reach out to Megami, who wasn't exactly interested in talking, but Yuji already established in his best main character voice that he wasn't going to give up on Megami, and thus to assume that Yuji is going to get another shot at awakening Megami is not crazy. In fact, it almost definitely will happen, and thus it's believed that with this second opportunity, Yuji will tap into his inner Naruto and talk no jutsu to Megami a little bit to awake him. However, when Megami awakes and takes over Sukuna's body, it won't be the old boy kissing Megami we all know and love. No, it's believed by this camp that after all the trauma that Megami has gone through, he'll either embrace his selfishness or just want to watch the world burn, which, I mean, fair, he watched his own hands kill his sister, the most important person on Earth to him, and he got hit by infinite void, and thus Megami will actually be the person who inherits Kenjaku's will, and thus he will become the final boss of JJK, and he will try to initiate the merger. But Yuji, our main character, will battle against Megami and either possibly bring him back from the brink, or force Megami to split his soul into 20 fingers that are then passed down for another 1,000 years. The other possibility is that Sukuna kills everybody, and after the merger has been initiated, Shoko is able to bring a couple people back from the dead. Most importantly, Yuji. Kind of like a hang in there, soap, we still gotta fight to win kind of moment. That, or Kusakabe is incorrect about whether or not sorcerers will be affected by the merger, and trust me, that wouldn't be the first time that Kusakabe was incorrect about something as it pertained to Sukuna, and therefore either sorcerers are affected by the merger or dead sorcerers are affected by the merger. But those dead sorcerers, when brought together with the rest of the Japanese populace, come back to life in some capacity of the hive mind, at which point Yuji, who was created to be a host, takes control of the Super Tengen and battles against Sukuna and wins. But regardless of which of those two endings you believe is going to happen, there's more death ahead. And a lot of it. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. After chapter 254, what do you believe is the most likely ending for JJK? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. What's the over-under on how many chapters Miguel lasts in this fight against Sukuna? It's gotta be 1.5, right? And if it's 1.5, you gotta take the under. I mean, Maki got 1 chapter. If Miguel gets 2, that's just massive disrespect.